Now our next professor, following up with Jeff's presentation from the University of San Francisco, comes from Eastern Connecticut State University. And she was thankfully with us for 3 years. She did her PhD at the University of Hawaii and worked on a bit of a Gupta and Indian philosophy of the body, and has created for us, I think very provocative in the best sense, a hashtag #MeToo presentation. Her name is Professor Ana Funes, and her undergraduate and her MA is from the Autonomous University of Mexico City, which is vast. It has over 300,000 students. The campus stretches beyond the horizon, and her family is long part of, particularly the Department of Geography there. And her quest for learning more about India led her out of Mexico.
Oh, I got it.
And it came. Okay, so hashtag #MeToo.
Wait, how do I make it big?
Okay.
I'm not a math. Hello everybody, it's good to be here again, see you known faces. The topic I'll be talking about today, a feminist phenomenological approach to the notion of body in classical Sāṃkhya, is actually a topic that some of the ideas that I'll be developing here gestated while I was teaching here in the Masters in Yoga Studies. In a lot of our discussions about what the body is, the experience of the feminine yogini doing yoga in the West, and how one confronts the yogic text coming from a patriarchal society, etc. And particularly my interest incorporating feminism into the reading of these Indian philosophical texts arises from the concern that if you're encountering a dualistic system that poses reality as on one side you have consciousness and on the other side you have embodiment or nature, and then you associate those two categories, one with male and the other one with the female, it is a problem for feminist thought because historically there is a hierarchical position between consciousness and body. So if you bring consciousness over the body, then there are all these systems denying the importance of the body, trying to get away from the body, and yet we are here cultivating our bodies when we practice yoga. So, however, when reading Samkhya, it's a very particular type of dualism, because even though you have this duality between the feminine principle and the masculine principle, the body, when we talk about the body, it's already encompassing both principles. As Jeff already explained, the Vyakta Prakriti, the body is in some way, it's actually the Vyakta Prakriti. So when we are talking about the body in Samkhya, we are already talking about both principles working together. So even though the classical philosophy of Samkhya is famous for its metaphysical dualism, where expressed in the polarity between a pure conscious principle or puruṣa and an unconscious material principle, the mula prakriti, their coming together or their association between puruṣa and prakriti is often expressed as the interaction between a female and a male, with puruṣa representing the male and prakriti the female. Of course, we cannot, let's not read this in a simplistic way. This doesn't mean that to identify puruṣa's gaze as that of a man and Prakriti's natural power of progression with the role of a woman. We cannot make that reduction. Neither the use of feminine metaphors, such as that of a female dancer, or a milking cow, or a wife, to refer to Prakriti's function in the universe, nor the feminine gender of the Sanskrit word makes Prakriti a female. There is no justification in essentializing genders in a binary between the masculine cosmic principle and the feminine material principle, because both principles are present in all genders, including men and women and all aspects of creation. Nevertheless, there are gendered metaphors often used in Sāṃkhya to express the metaphysical functions of these two principles. And since conceptualizations of the masculine and the feminine have traditionally and still have an impact on the way that female and male subjectivities are constructed, it is relevant to analyze such conceptualizations to unearth unquestioned assumptions regarding sexual difference and offer new possibilities of meaning. So in this talk and in my essay, I examine such gendered metaphors in Sāṃkhyan philosophy to reveal that there is a problematic male gaze in the system, as it is illustrated in various metaphors used by the tradition to explain this puruṣa prakṛti relationality. But at the same time, I want to uncover, by recovering the notion of the body, particularly the notion of subtle body in Sāṃkhya philosophy, I want to recover an aspect in Sāṃkhya philosophy that brings to the fore something that has been previously overlooked and that Jeff tried to flesh out in his presentation for us. The interrelationality between puruṣa and prakṛti is played out in the realm of the body, in our bodies. So the feminist perspective, this is what I'm trying to show, the feminist perspective helps to see or to show that the recognition of the feminine aspect of embodiment in Sāṃkhya can guarantee a reciprocal and reversible interaction of both principles within the flesh. So
you can use the clicker here, Anna, it'll be better.
Oh, okay. I think it's better for me just to go traditional. So in Sāṃkhya Karika 61, prakṛti is referred as this. So it is my belief that there is no one more delicate and graceful than prakṛti, who, realizing I have been seen, never again comes to the sight of puruṣa. In the commentary, the Tattva Kaumudi on this verse, 19th century scholar Vachaspati Mishra interprets the adjective sukumara as modest, timid, or bashful. And then he compares prakṛti to a married lady from a noble family whose garment or veil has been accidentally blown away in public, exposing her body and head to the sight of strangers. Embarrassed and unable to bear being observed by other men, she takes extra care not to let this happen again by keeping herself, that is her body, forever inaccessible to the eyes of other men. But Vachaspati continues, in this way, prakṛti, being the most virtuous of all wives, out of discernment, does not expose herself again. Now, this passage perfectly expresses the gender dimension of Sāṃkhyan metaphysics. The experience of the world is brought about by the observation of prakṛti's body, but such observation is a product of an accident and a mistake. The exact cause of that mistake is unknown, as we saw with Jeff's presentation, so difficult to explain how they come together, as is the cause of this lady's disgraceful unclothing. Her naked body, however, is seen as an object of desire by the voyeurs, the male strangers who enjoy looking at her. However, in their enjoyment, they ignore that this experience is binding them to the suffering marked by continuous rounds of satisfactions and frustrations. Their desire causes them to feel attraction towards the object enjoyed and frustration for its loss. Puruṣa, represented by the male observers, forgets himself in what he sees and misidentifies himself in the midst of prakṛti's actions, thus thinking that he is experiencing happiness and sadness, virtues and vice, knowledge and ignorance, etc. On the other hand, the hiding lady, representing prakṛti's withdrawal into the unmanifested, the avyaktam form of reality, and has as its consequence the seer's liberation, who, having enjoyed the experience, separates himself from it. Consequently, the seer recognizes himself alone as pure consciousness, as an immutable seer liberated from all passion. So, traditionally, according to Ishvara Krishna, Prakriti is characterized by her multiple qualities, her gunas. She can move in an energetic way, rajas, or she can remain calm and delightful, sattva, or become obscure and dense, tamas. And all her movements and actions would be nothing if they were not observed by puruṣa. This is why it is said in another Sāṃkhya Karika verse, number 60, that Prakriti moves for the sake of the observer without benefit for herself, for she is supposed to be unconscious. Moreover, in the classical description of this relationship, Prakriti assists with puruṣa's liberation without him doing anything for her. In Vachaspati's interpretation of Sāṃkhya Karika 61, he gives, perhaps inadvertently, a different Sāṃkhyan perspective on the supposedly unconscious nature of Prakriti's action. Vachaspati imagines his modest, delicate lady liberating herself from the unbearable gaze of the male lookers by hiding her body, that is, the seen object, away from them. Prakriti is the one who, in spite of being unconscious, for she is matter, not consciousness, discerns the difference between her and the disembodied onlooker, and who resorts to hiding away from being determined as an object of desire. So in his analogy, it is Prakriti who acts for her own sake by preventing repeated exposure and avoiding any further embarrassment or any further mistake. And in doing so, her actions benefit the onlookers, that's the puruṣas, with their own liberation. So the question is, what makes the gaze of the observer, which is gendered as male in the Sāṃkhyan account, so unbearable? Both the feminine and the masculine principles in Sāṃkhya have the same level of importance. We could say half-jokingly that there is a metaphysical gender equality in Sāṃkhya philosophy. They are both eternal, uncreated, independent from each other, and both are equally responsible for the manifestation of the world. However, Ishvara's classical account is marked by the lack of reciprocity between both principles, also visible in the gendered metaphors of the spectator and the dancer, the husband and the wife, as will be shown later. Missing in the classical formulation of Sāṃkhya, as pointed out by Alfred Collins here, also present, is puruṣa's acknowledgement of Prakriti as a self, as a subjectivity that acts for her own sake. Yet, in Vachaspati's metaphor of the modest lady, shows that there might be an intersubjective reciprocal aspect within Sāṃkhyan dualism, only unveiled if the perspective of the system is assumed from her eyes, which is what I think Jeff sort of did also. He positioned himself on the eyes from the perspective of Vyakta Prakriti. So that's what I want to do as well. I want to assume her perspective, and to assume her perspective requires a movement that can situate us within her body. So the rest of this paper and the rest of my talk will try to offer such move. And in order for the feminine perspective to emerge within the reading of classical Sāṃkhyan philosophy, a feminine phenomenological approach to the notion of sharira, or body, is necessary. So as seen with the Vachaspati's Mishra's interpretation of Sāṃkhya Karika 61, the interaction between puruṣa and prakriti plays out clearly in the naked exposition of that modest lady's body. So what is the body in Sāṃkhya tradition? There is an initial distinction that the Sāṃkhya Karika does between the biological body and the subtle body. So the biological body is the one we obtain through our mother and father, matri pitri ja, composed according to Sāṃkhya by the combination of 5 material elements: earth, water, fire, air, and ether. The physical or biological body is the one that can be easily perceived, as constituted by the limbs, members, and organs ears, eyes, nose, etc. The subtle body, on the other hand, is not transmitted by mother and father. It is constituted by the intellect or reflective mind, buddhi, the ego, ahankara, the attentive mind, the capacities of sensation and action, as well as the modes of sense content, as Miquel translates in his book. So Sāṃkhya establishes a derivative relation between these bodily elements. In Sāṃkhya Karika 22, that relation is established as this. From the primordial nature, or the mula prakriti, arises, from the primordial nature arises the intellect. From the intellect arises the ego maker. From the ego maker arises the set of 16. So those 16 is the attentive mind, the 10 sensory motor faculties, and the 5 modes of sense content. And from the 5 modes of sense content arise the 5 gross elements. So there are a lot of, there have been different interpretations on how to understand this derivation. And the traditional one, what I call the metaphysical interpretation, distinguishes the subtle body from the gross body in a metaphysical sense. But in order to try to give meaning to this metaphysical derivation, people like Larson or what's his name, Bujastik, have proposed that instead of translating Sukshma Sharira or Linga Sharira as subtle body, one should translate as minute body. However, I don't want to stick to that interpretation because my reading is trying to get the phenomenological aspects of it. So I don't really care what those entities are, but how the body is experienced. Then Miquel's interpretation in his book that appeals to a Kantian interpretation and a Husserlian interpretation distinguishes the subtle body as a transcendental system, as conditions of possibility for experience to emerge. However, the phenomenological interpretation that I'm trying to offer here is based on Merleau-Ponty's interpretation because it is in Merleau-Ponty's interpretation of flesh, or the notion of body, that we can see the dynamicity of the subtle body that I see the previous two interpretations lacking. So I'm going to try to make that clearer. So let's see. So Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology is very useful to shed light on the Sāṃkhyan understanding of the body, because a phenomenological reading does not need to respond to what kind of entities Sāṃkhya is talking about when referring to all these elements, because it takes those elements not as evolutes or entities, but as experiential layers. So for example, the hands, the legs, the eyes, the ears can be easily perceived by oneself through a mirror or by looking at your body, and by others. But to perceive the capacity of hearing, the capacity of seeing, the capacity of walking, of grasping, etc., requires a special mode of attention, the type of phenomenological attention that Merleau-Ponty exemplifies with the example of the left hand touching the right hand, which in turn is touching an object. So to perceive the touched hand is different than perceive the same hand touching. The hand is the organ by which the capacity of touching or grasping is enacted. The touched hand is an object, but the touching hand is the bodily awareness that arises in the midst of its own activity. However, normally this activity is transparent to one's own consciousness. We do not normally pay attention to our body when we act. The moment you came here and grabbed a chair to sit down, you didn't have to pay attention to how you put your hand and how you pull the chair, etc. It was all transparent to you. The body becomes sort of absent from your experience. But yet, the sense in which the Sāṃkhyan body is subtle should not be confused with that which is difficult to conceptualize or to objectify through one's reflection. The bodily capacities of sensation, action, and cognition are subtle precisely because of the difficulty to categorize them as part of a fixed and objective or transcendental perceptual system. They are instead the enactment of an embodied dynamicity that moves, like the perception of the touching hand, between the subjective and the objective, the abstract and the concrete, the particular and universal, the private and the shared, the hidden and the manifest, the subject and the object. Merleau-Ponty's notion of flesh, which he gives a description or definition in the intertwining or the chiasm. When we speak of the flesh of the visible, we mean that carnal being as a being of depths, of several lives or several faces, a being in latency, and the presentation of a certain absence is a prototype of being, of which our body, the sensible sentient, is a very remarkable variant, but whose constitutive paradox already lies in every visible. It is that ambiguity of the body of being sensible and sentient at the same time that can be also found in the notion of linga in the Sāṃkhya system. Linga refers to the body in its capacity of being always an identification of something else. Linga, in its literal sense, means a mark or a sign. The body is always pointing towards something else, something other than itself, either because it is oriented outwardly towards the physical objects and the environment upon which it acts, or more precisely for Sāṃkhya, because it is a sign that points towards consciousness. Since the body itself is not conscious, ultimately within Sāṃkhyan dualism, the very experience of awareness must come from something other than the body itself. The body is thus a mark that signals through sensing, acting, paying attention, self-reflecting, remembering, imagining, the existence of both principles, the conscious and the material, just as the smoke signals the existence of fire behind the mountain. So for Sāṃkhya, vision, or the world of experience and embodiment, represents a place of affectivity and suffering, mainly because it gives place to a mistaken association between the body and the seer, the observer. As long as the seer perceives himself, and indeed consciousness is represented as male in Sāṃkhya, as acting, feeling, or sensing, there is the illusion of consciousness being affected by vice or virtue, pain or pleasure. As soon as the mistaken association disintegrates, the body, especially the subtle body, or the avyakta prakriti, merges, which is another sense of linga, into the unmanifested and non-conscious material principle, constituted by the undifferentiated manifold of forces that remain in equilibrium and in pure potentiality. So, phenomenologically speaking, the body in Sāṃkhya amounts to a bare field of possible experience, without a sense of self associated to the body, that is, without any mark, or the alinga, which is another word for the avyakta or the mula prakriti, without any mark of self-identification, the body merges back into its source, an undifferentiated mass of pure potentiality. But in the distinction between biological and subtle body, that which is not given by mother or the father, that which is not passed down by genetics, is the cosmic elements and the modes in which they are sensed. For example, the color of the hair, the type of blood, the thickness of the bones, the length of the marrow, etc., are determined by parents' genes. But the food, which might be associated with the element of earth, that the mother eats and will nourish the unborn child, or the liquidity that surrounds the fetus, or the warmth that comes from the mother's skin, or the breathing air that moves rhythmically resonating in the womb, and the space that the unborn body pervades, all this is not given by genes, but by the cosmic elements or the immediate environment. And the way our body perceives those elements will determine the way the body perceives itself when it is born. So even before there is experience of the eyes, the ears, the legs, and hands, there is indeed at least an intimate and determinate affective experience of seeing, hearing, moving, touching. So it is in this way that the subtle pre-arises to the gross body. And it is in this sense that the Sāṃkhyan subtle body is, just as Merleau-Ponty's flesh, an elemental body. So, so now I'm trying to explain how this way of understanding the subtle body relates to the phenomenological notion of reversibility. Because reversibility refers to the ability of the body to see itself in the act of making something else visible. For example, in the act of shaking hands, the shaking hand is at the same time a hand being shaked. However, while it is easy to see the movement of the shaking hand, we might not easily see the feeling or the intention or the thoughts or the dispositions that may be implicit in that act. Those dispositions were called bhavas in Sāṃkhya, and Sāṃkhya thought of them, of the bhavas, as aromas perfuming with their pre-arising determinations, which can be positive or negative, determining all our motor sensorial capacities, our mind, our ego, our intellect, and leaving their affective psychic traces behind our attitudes, patterns, actions, movements, and responses. So it is precisely because of this indivisibility of the flesh, in the sense that it is not so easy to see what type of affectivity is being played out in the visible, that Luce Irigaray, this feminist French phenomenologist, points out the possibility of our flesh not sharing the same dispositions with others. So the flesh can be non-reversible, especially when it only sees what it wants to see or to imagine. In other words, the shaking hand or the hearing ear or the seeing eye, etc., is not always perceiving itself being shaken, heard, or seen by another because of the non-reversible character of the flesh, and because this entails an aspect of our flesh that cannot recognize the other in their difference. The recognition, for Luce Irigaray, the hidden invisible is precisely the place of difference, because it is in this hidden invisible that affectivity resides. And the recognition of the impossibility of total objectification of the other body makes it a tangible invisible that remains beyond graspable visible moment. So the subtle body is then the affective, the intellectual, and the dispositional dimensions of our embodiment that remains, lasts, and endures even when our body, born out of parents, perishes, when our biological body perishes. So it is in that sense that it's transmitted from generation to generation, that lingers between the unmanifested and manifested moments, the past and the future, reincarnating from one body to another, reproducing dispositions of insight or ignorance, attachment or detachment, etc. So the subtle body is for Sāṃkhya the place of suffering where the human predicament begins and ends. It is precisely that which has to be seen as something other and distinct to our real self. To stress this visibility of the difference of the subtle body in regards to puruṣa, the Sāṃkhya tradition genderizes the relation between self and nature, the seer and the seen. It symbolizes the non-suffering experience in the image of an unproductive elderly couple, a metaphor that a Sāṃkhyan philosopher called Matara used in his Commentator to explain the moment in which the pure principle of consciousness, or puruṣa, recognizes itself as distinct to the material unconscious one. And there is this karika, number 66, that says, "I have seen her," says the spectating one. "I have been seen," says the other, desisting. Although the two remain in conjunction, there is no initiation of further emergence. So this passage seems to imply that the only purpose for for prakṛti's visibility, that is for the birth of embodied existence, is for the pleasing of a disembodied male conscious principle. So the material unconscious principle, like a beautiful dancer, displays her movements before the observer. And this one attains full satisfaction of its experience as consciousness only until the show is done. A relation like this, as in Irigaray's perspective, lacks any possibility of reversibility. The seer is not really seen back by the scene, since this one is not conscious, or vice versa. The wife or the lover, like in this painting by Bhattacharjee, is not really seen by the husband or the partner now that the narcissistic pleasure of the night before has ceased and he is awake. The extreme objectification of the other, represented here as female, guarantees the liberation of the seer, that is, of the male gaze. Purusha's liberation, expressed in the metaphor of the male's gaze, would seem to be egotistic, narcissistic, and self-absorbed. However, although Sāṃkhya metaphysical dualism presents a metaphysical gender equality, it lacks gender reciprocity. But there is perhaps a metaphor where we could see the Sāṃkhya karika providing a reciprocal relation between the two principles. And this simile is the one between the lame and the blind, or the paralytic and the blind. So in this simile, Sāṃkhya compares the association between puruṣa and prakṛti between the lame and a blind person. The blind helps the lame by carrying him under his shoulders, while the lame directs the way with his eyes. The commentator to this karika in the Suvarna Saptati, which is the commentary translated from the Chinese into Sanskrit by Paramartha, narrates a background story to this karika, in which there was a caravan attacked by a group of thieves. All the merchants fled, leaving behind a blind and a paralytic. And this is part of the story. The infirm one asked him, "Who are you?" The other replied, "I am blind from birth. Not knowing the road, I run without aim. But who are you?" The infirm one replied, "I am paralytic from birth. I am capable of seeing the road, but I cannot march. I propose that you take me on your shoulders and that you carry me while I show the road." Associating themselves in that fashion, the two men could get to their homes. By means of such a union, they could attain their goal. So in this simile, the recognition of each other in their subjectivity is granted by the question, "Who are you?" Both see each other in their desperation, weakness, need, and possibility to help each other. They meet in their embodied disability and work together for the benefit of both. Only under this metaphor is the feminine principle, represented here by the figure of the blind, recognized as having a purpose for her own sake. Lost my track. While all other metaphors take prakṛti as working for the sake of Purusha's emancipation, this one clearly pictures a reciprocal action for the sake of the emancipation of both. So Luce Irigaray says that in order for there to be reversibility and a non-narcissistic way of seeing, the maternal feminine must not be forgotten. And in the context of Sāṃkhya, I take this to mean that only if we turn to see the cosmic elements of the body without the metaphysics, will we have a clear, reversible vision of oneself and the other. This means that we need to recognize each other as irreducible bodies. The metaphor of disability reflects this irreducibility well. The seen body is also a seer, albeit blind, because even if the seer, that's the paralytic, cannot see the other seeing back, the paralytic recognizes the blind as an other with its own needs, fears, strengths, and vulnerability. So behind the blind body, there is an other, a subtle body that looks back at us from its own place of difference. So behind the visible elements and the visible bodies are subtle determinations that affect the embodied experience of our subjectivity and that predispose our desires, emotions, and behaviors even before these become manifest, as the phenomenological analysis of the unborn body shows. Our bodies are always possible objects of another's gaze, and at the same time refrain from being fully objectifiable, because they are subtle, affective, sentient. In this sense, if we analyze the subtle body under a feminist phenomenological lens, we can understand this dynamic process of awareness that precedes and determines our dispositions towards the environment and our relationship to others, dispositions that are always affective and which may remain as a hidden invisible in a lifetime, migrating from body to body for generations. So as long as the subtle body remains unknown and unrecognized, our flesh will remain non-reversible. The reason for this is that seeing oneself and others without recognizing those invisible determinations at the root of our differences makes our vision of the world ego-centered and conducive to the experience of affliction and suffering. A non-suffering existence might instead be possible when the body, that is the other material being that opposes our seeing, stops being seen merely as an object and starts being recognized as a subject in its own right. In other words, when prakṛti is considered not only as the seen, but as a seer in its own right. So both the images of the modest, delicate lady and the blind man show a Sāṃkhyan subjectivity that recognizes its dimension in the body, with the lady, and the mutual purpose of existence in liberating one another, with the blind mind. And the relevance of the maternal feminine category that Luce Irigaray provides becomes evident in Sāṃkhya philosophy when the body is recovered in its relationality with the environment and the cosmic elements. So from this perspective, the Sāṃkhyan phenomenology of embodiment can offer a productive, reversible, bearable, and non-narcissistic account of experience, or a darshana, a vision as reciprocal seeing. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for some questions. First, it has to sink in to the flesh. But I'll start because there was a very subtle move here which was reflected in the reversibility. And this notion that the subject becomes the object and the object becomes the subject, without the two collapsing into one another, gives credence to this remaining irreducible to a simple monism. And when Jeff introduced, he said there are so many puzzles in this system. And I think that you've done a great deal to not only unpack one of the great puzzles, which is what do we do in that moment of reciprocity when prakṛti ceases to dance? And I think that you've really retrieved that and re-empowered in a very, very profound way. And I particularly like how you opened by saying that we must always guard against falling into a facile genderization. And this has been one of the enduring difficulties of the Sāṃkhya is that this trope of somehow the woman is material and bad, and somehow the man is the witness and superior and spiritual and good, that you read the text and you know that's not what's being said, but nonetheless so many people have just sort of run with that way of, oh, that's why women aren't educated in India, or things like that. So. Chris?
Maybe you have something to say about this. I just read Jeffrey Samuel's Origins of Yoga and Tantra, and there he gives a history of where some of these ideas emerged. Aesthetic practices, the Shramana traditions, and he sort of, I don't know if he's correct in doing it, but he separates the Brahmanical from the Buddhist, and kind of gives the argument that these two traditions, the arose separate from each other. And I know other scholars have made that argument too, that Buddhism is not a reaction to the Brahmanical religions, but Buddhism is itself its own. And these other Shramana traditions, Jainism also, they grew in this, out of this area that in more the central Gangetic plane, where the feminine wasn't demoted. The feminine was celebrated as for fertility and prosperity and abundance, and it wasn't demoted. And basically what I'm getting out of this text is that Sāṃkhya and some of these other traditions and the way that they portray the feminine classically or historically was kind of a Brahmanical retrieval and demotion of the feminine. So what I guess with this kind of a comment is that what I'm hearing in yours is, and what you're presenting is more of a retrieval of that, what emerged out of the central Gangetic plane, and a retrieval of the feminine is not something that's to be demoted to the masculine, but something that's to be celebrated for all the various reasons.
Yeah, yeah, probably. I mean, there has been a ascetic renunciating reading of Samkhya, for sure, and this recovering of the feminine perspective or the manifested perspective gives a totally different take on what is actually the feminine principle within Samkhya itself. But I mean, I don't deny that there are these aspects of dualistic thinking that are very problematic. And my whole point is that if we read Samkhya in a metaphysical way, then the male gaze is cannot avoid the total objectification of the other and the identification of that other as a female. But if we read it phenomenologically, because phenomenologically entails already the move towards the body and the experience of the body and the experience of life, then you have this completely different vision of what the feminine within Samkhya is doing for the system, which is not anymore just working for puruṣa, but is working in a reciprocal way.
Present.
Yeah, I would like to know what would you comment on such applications of prakṛti as in Indian ecofeminist writing, like Madana Shiva's usage of prakṛti. What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, I describe myself into a project of rereading these texts to recover a different notion of nature and a different notion of body that is meaningful not only for women, but also for a social context where we need to relate to the elements and the earth in more reciprocal ways. So it's not anymore this male metaphysical consciousness which is there to appropriate the earth and make it productive and make it work for the sake of the puruṣa, but it's now a working together to liberate both. So yes, I mean, for me, doing this rereading of the tradition enhances these projects that are trying to reconfigure our relation with the world and environment.
Would you agree with this, I mean, that prakṛti is after all transgender category? I think she mentioned something like that.
Well, I'm not familiar with where she says that, but no, I mean, I mean, this is a gendered metaphysics. For me, that's clear. But I wouldn't call it transgender. I would probably go towards the androgynous type of.
Okay, Jai first, and then
Thank you for the time and wisdom. One of the many virtues I heard in your speech was that on the male equation, one can be, in a sense, liberated from the desire and frustration, whereas from the female, one is empowered in her own being. I'd love to ask, do you find that such perspective can be practiced, or is to merely be understood at such a profound level that at which time it shifts one's perspective?
Wait, so is your question about me thinking that Sāṃkhya philosophy is just at the theoretical level, or is it proposing a particular way of living? Is that your question?
In a sense, more so I think that essentially, can you offer any insight into how one can practice such a phenomenal perspective? And is there hope for men, you know, in a sense? Or is it merely that by studying it to a certain extent, once one achieves that understanding, you know, you kind of flip over to the other side and you're more liberated from the oppressive nature of the misunderstanding?
So there is going to be a talk that actually I think will address your question better than what I can say. But I think that the importance of understanding it at the intellectual level relies in the fact that it doesn't end in the intellectual level, that it provides a way in which to see ourselves and our own patterns falling into either the metaphysical, unbearable male gaze, or on the reciprocal type of self-other nurturing perspective. And I'm not saying that the male gaze is just particularly for males. I mean, some women also have male gazes. I mean, this is not to say that only men have the problem of a metaphysical male gaze. This is something that women also have. It's not, that's why I don't want to essentialize. So, yes, in understanding, in making the exercise of understanding the theory is at the same time an exercise of self-understanding yourself in the way you relate to others. Now, that's a process, and I don't have the, the full response, but yes, I think that that's the implication of doing this analysis, that it will provide tools for self-reflection and transformation.
Thank you.
Okay, Jen?
I'm kind of going back to playing with the Mishra metaphor in my head. So then, taking that stance, what happens then when the woman's there, the veil blows away, and she doesn't try and cover up. What?
Oh, you're playing. What if she didn't want to cover? Oh. Yes, I mean, that's a possibility. Perhaps we need a Sāṃkhya where prakṛti just wants to keep dancing, and where prakṛti enjoys being observed and wants to be observed. Because that's the problem, right? I mean, she cannot tolerate the male gaze, and that's why she is hiding away. I mean, I'm going with the story.
Yeah.
But perhaps in this Samyoga, it's not just puruṣa making the movement of observing prakṛti. It's prakṛti has within herself an urge of being observed. And in a way that is not unbearable, in a way that bears creation. Right? So I'm with Jeff in that way.
Okay, Al, did you want to say something?
Well, I thought this was a very fine paper. I want to preface with that. I think the words drishṭaham and drishṭamaya, which are uttered by prakrti and puruṣa, relate to the later Hindu idea of darshan, okay, where the worshipper sees the God, who sees the worshipper seeing the God, in an infinite reflectivity, so that they have equal amounts of seeing and of being seen. So it's exactly the same between puruṣa and prakrti. Prakrti sees as much as puruṣa sees and is seen in the same way that puruṣa is seen.
Yeah, so in a sense, probably maybe as a full circle with the first question, what I want to do with Sāṃkhya is purify it from the metaphysical dualistic readings that take this type of darshan as just the puruṣa observing, I have been observed, and then there is no further relationality.
Yeah. It's like an asymptote or something. They grow gradually closer and closer and closer until they're indistinguishable. As it says in the text at the end, both puruṣa and prakrti achieve kaivalya, right? And the last verse, or not the last verse, but the last verse of the Yoga Sutra, and then one of the last verses of the Sāṃkhya Karaka also, they become indistinguishable.
Beautiful. Okay, we're going to take a 15-minute